Everyone thought the missing cruise ship Aurora Line was lost in a storm. But when a lonely hunter found it wedged on a cliff, he uncovered a secret the ocean refused to hide. Subscribe, like the video, and tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? The storm had raged for 3 days without mercy. When the clouds finally broke, the coastline looked like a battlefield between earth and sea. Trees torn from the soil, cliffs bitten away, the ground itself reshaped by wind and water. The air still trembled with the echo of thunder, and a fine mist of salt clung to everything. Miles Harper walked slowly along the soaked trail above the cliffs, his old dog Bo padding close at his side. He carried a rifle slung over his shoulder and a pack filled with rope, a knife, and the same battered thermos he'd used since his days at sea. He was used to silence, to the kind of quiet that settles after storms when the world holds its breath. But that morning, the quiet was wrong. It felt heavy, watchful, as if the sea itself were waiting for something. The path beneath his boots was slick with mud. Every step made the earth groan. Bo sniffed the air, her tail low, uneasy. The wind carried a strange taste, metallic, sharp, not the smell of salt or wet rock, but of something older and stranger. Miles paused. There it was again, a faint hum beneath the wind and the waves. It wasn't the cry of seabirds or the grinding of shifting stones. It sounded deeper, hollow, almost mechanical. He frowned, scanning the fog that hung thick over the cliffs. For a moment, he saw nothing but gray. Then the mist shifted, and the shape appeared. At first, he thought it was a mirage, a wall of steel rising out of the earth. Then the fog thinned, and his breath caught. There, lodged between two massive rock formations, was a ship. Not a fishing vessel or a freighter, but something colossal. Its bow jutted out into the open air hanging over the abyss. Its stern was buried in torn soil and broken trees. The hull was streaked with rust, the paint stripped away by wind and salt, and gulls circled high above it, crying once before falling silent again. Miles stood frozen. In all his years living on this wild stretch of coast, he had never seen anything like it. The sheer size of the thing defied logic. It was a cruise liner, easily 300 meters long, a mountain of corroded steel balanced precariously over the sea. The cliff beneath it groaned with each gust of wind. Bo barked sharply, breaking his trance. The sound echoed and was swallowed by the fog. Miles began to move again, descending toward the base of the cliff where a narrow path wound between the rocks. The ground was unstable, sliding under his boots, but curiosity drove him forward. When he reached the bottom, he found what might once have been a loading ramp, now half collapsed and overgrown with seaweed. A thick cable trailed from the ship's underside into the mud, snapped clean in two. He crouched and touched it, corroded but not ancient. Maybe a year, maybe two, not long enough for the ocean to forget. He lifted his gaze again to the monstrous silhouette above him. It was impossible that a storm had thrown something so massive this far inland. The nearest shipping lane was hundreds of miles away. Still, the evidence stood before him. Metal groaning, the faint echo of waves below, and that strange hum vibrating in the air like the dying breath of some mechanical giant. Bo whined and nudged his leg. Miles followed the dog's gaze to a narrow gangway that hung from the ship's side, twisted and bent, but still attached. It led upward across the rocks like a ladder into the sky. He hesitated, his sailor's instincts whispering caution. Dead ships were dangerous. They shifted, collapsed, trapped the curious. But the other part of him, the part that had once braved storms halfway across the world, urged him forward. He slung his rifle tighter across his back, tested the first step of the gangway, and began to climb. The metal creaked under his weight, algae slick beneath his boots. Below him, the sea roared against the cliffs. Above, the ship loomed like a wall between worlds. Bo followed close behind, paws slipping, claws scraping for purchase. When they reached the torn hull, Miles stopped to catch his breath. A jagged opening yawned before him, edges of steel bent outward like the petals of a dead flower. Inside, only darkness. He switched on his flashlight, and the beam cut through a haze of dust and salt crystals. The corridor beyond stretched deep into the ship's belly. Peeling wallpaper clung to the walls. Brass fixtures had turned green with corrosion. The air was heavy, stale, unmoving. Every breath tasted of rust and mold. Miles stepped inside, and his boots echoed against the metal floor. The sound traveled down the passageway, returning like a whisper. Bo stayed close, her ears flat, tail low. The ship groaned softly, a deep vibration moving through its bones. Somewhere in the distance, water dripped steadily, a rhythm that marked forgotten time. He passed what looked like a reception area. An overturned desk lay half buried in debris. Brochures littered the floor, their ink washed away. On the wall, faint letters spelled Aurora Line. He froze. That name. He remembered it. A luxury cruise liner that had vanished 3 years ago in the Atlantic. The news had called it a tragedy, a mystery of the sea. No wreckage, no survivors, no signal. And yet here it was, perched on the edge of a cliff 1,000 miles from any search zone. Miles shone his light across the room. The glass of a display case had shattered, revealing rows of tarnished silverware. A painting lay face down in a puddle. He righted it, an image of calm blue waters under a bright sun. The irony made his stomach tighten. He moved deeper into the ship. Each corridor looked the same. Long, narrow, lined with doors marked Cabin 104, Laundry, Crew Access. Most were locked or jammed. The air grew colder. He turned a corner and found a staircase leading upward. Through the gaps in the ceiling above, faint light filtered through, pale and colorless. He climbed carefully, his hand brushing against the damp rail. At the top, he stepped out onto what had once been the promenade deck. The view stole his breath. The sea stretched endlessly below, gray and immense. The ship's bow jutted over open space, its tip disappearing into fog. The wind howled through broken windows, and the entire structure shuddered faintly. Miles gripped the railing, dizzy from the height. The deck was littered with remnants of life. Chairs overturned, a child's doll lying face down, a coffee cup still half full of stagnant water. Everything was frozen mid-motion, as if the people had vanished in a single instant. He crouched, picked up the doll, and stared at its glass eyes clouded with salt. Then he set it down gently. Bo growled low, ears perked. Miles followed her gaze toward the far end of the deck. A door hung slightly open. It led toward the ship's bridge. He hesitated, the sense of intrusion heavy on his chest, but he couldn't stop now. Inside, the bridge was a ruin of silence. Control panels covered in dust, shattered glass underfoot. The captain's wheel was still locked in place, the compass cracked. On the navigation desk lay a chart, the paper yellowed and brittle. A red line marked a route across the Atlantic, ending abruptly in a blank space. Next to it, in hurried handwriting, deviation approved, satellite link severed. He felt the air grow colder around him. The wind whistled through the cracks in the walls, and the ship let out a long, hollow moan. Bo pressed close against his leg, trembling. Miles stood perfectly still, listening. For a moment, he thought he heard something, A faint metallic knock from somewhere deep below, slow and deliberate. Then silence. He looked once more through the broken windows. The sky had darkened, the sea below a churning mass of gray. Rain began to fall again, tapping softly on the deck plates. He exhaled, steadying his breath. Whatever had happened here, it was not over. He turned back toward the stairwell. The beam of his flashlight flickered as he began his descent into the lower decks. The sound of dripping water echoed around him, each drop a heartbeat in the dark. The air grew warmer, thicker. The smell of oil mixed with the faint sweetness of decay. Miles paused on the landing and looked up. Through a hole in the ceiling, a sliver of gray sky stared down like an unblinking eye. He tightened the strap of his pack, adjusted his rifle, and whispered to Bo, "Stay close." Together, they stepped deeper into the ship's hollow ribs, into the silence that waited like a breath held too long. What lay below, Miles didn't yet know, but the feeling in his gut told him this was no ordinary wreck. The Aurora Line hadn't simply been lost, it had been hidden. And now, after years of silence, the sea had given it back. He just didn't yet know why. The second night after the storm was colder than any in recent memory. The fog rolled in heavy and low, swallowing sound and light until even the cliffs disappeared into the gray. Miles Harper hadn't slept. His small cabin stood only a mile from where the ship now loomed, and all night the wind carried faint metallic groans from its broken hull. It was as if the Aurora Line were breathing, slow, uneasy, alive. By dawn, Miles could no longer ignore the pull. He packed food, batteries, and a rope, then set out again with Bo trotting close beside him. The morning light was pale, almost colorless, and when they reached the edge of the cliff, the giant shadow of the ship still hung there, suspended between land and sea. Mist curled around its bow like smoke from a dying fire. The gangway he'd climbed the day before still held, though it groaned louder now, strained by the shifting metal. Inside, the air was damp and colder than outside. Miles switched on his flashlight, and the beam cut through a haze of dust and salt particles. Everything smelled faintly of fuel and rot. He retraced his path through the corridor and back into the heart of the vessel. The silence was deeper today, the kind that makes a man feel like an intruder in someone else's grave. Bo's nails clicked softly on the metal floor, echoing off the walls. In the lounge area, tables were still set, plates stacked, silverware lined neatly beside glasses half filled with murky water. A child's toy lay in a puddle beneath one table, a bright red race car, its paint chipped. He picked it up, turned it over. On the bottom, a name was written in faded marker. Ethan. He pocketed it without knowing why. Past the dining room, a narrow hallway led to a staircase that descended into the lower decks. The air grew warmer, almost sticky, and smelled faintly chemical. There were signs on the walls, yellowed paper with black symbols and warnings in languages he didn't recognize. His flashlight beam landed on one word repeated several times. Restricted. Bo hesitated at the top of the stairs, whining. Miles knelt, rubbed her head. "It's all right, girl," but his voice didn't sound convincing, even to him. They descended slowly. The light flickered. At the bottom of the stairs, he found another corridor, narrower, darker. A few doors had numbers but no handles. Others were sealed shut with metal plating. His boots splashed in a thin layer of water that ran along the floor, reflecting the flashlight in broken ripples. He stopped at the first unsealed door and tried the handle. It opened reluctantly with a long metallic shriek. The room beyond was small, lined with bunks and scattered papers. He stepped inside, brushing dust from a clipboard that hung beside the doorway. The first page made his stomach tighten. Helios Foundation Passenger Observation Log. Subject Group C. Week 7. Increased irritability, elevated temperature, persistent coughing. Quarantine recommended. Miles turned the page. More entries, heart rates, temperature readings, notes about vocal distortion and loss of coordination. Each page ended with the same initials, HL. He set the clipboard down, his pulse quickening. Helios Foundation. He'd heard that name before. Years ago, back when he still worked the docks in Maine, there were rumors about them. Private contracts, secret research at sea, ships that vanished. Nobody ever proved anything, and the stories faded like myths told by drunks. But here, in his hands, was proof. He searched the room and found a small crate beneath one of the bunks. Inside were glass vials, each labeled with a barcode and a date. The liquid inside was cloudy, amber-colored. He didn't touch them. Beau's growl snapped him back. She stood near the doorway, staring down the corridor, fur bristling. Miles lifted the flashlight. For an instant, he thought he saw movement, something shifting at the far end, just beyond the beam's reach. He called out, "Hello?" Silence. He stepped into the hallway again, the sound of dripping water echoing behind him. The light flickered once more and caught on a set of letters scrawled in something dark across the wall. "Don't open the lower hold." His throat went dry. The writing looked smeared by hand, desperate. He followed the direction of the arrow beneath it. It pointed to a hatch farther down the hall, rusted, sealed with bolts, but with fresh scratches around the edges as though someone had tried to pry it open. He crouched to inspect it. The metal was bent inward, not outward. Whatever had forced that hatch had come from the inside. A chill ran through him. He straightened slowly, scanning the corridor. The hum he'd heard outside the day before was louder down here, pulsing faintly through the floor. He couldn't tell if it was machinery still running or something else entirely. On the wall beside the hatch, another message had been etched with a knife. We were the experiment. Miles backed away, his breath quickening. Beau whimpered, pressing against his leg. They turned and climbed back toward the upper decks, each step echoing like a heartbeat. When they reached the promenade again, daylight had turned to dull gray twilight. He stood by the railing, staring out at the endless ocean. The truth was beginning to take shape in his mind, terrible and undeniable. This ship hadn't been lost to a storm. It had been abandoned. He walked to the bridge once more. Dust coated everything. The chart he'd seen before was still there, but now he noticed another folder beneath it. Thin, water-stained, marked with the Helios logo. Inside were printed reports, fragments of emails, signatures blacked out. One message was dated 3 years ago. To Captain H. Lawson, from Director S. Roth, Helios Foundation. Effective immediately, the vessel Aurora Line will proceed to coordinates attached. You are to maintain blackout conditions. Do not transmit distress. Confirm isolation of passenger Group C. Medical oversight will continue on site until collection. He read the words twice, then a third time. Collection, not evacuation, not rescue. A low creak ran through the deck, followed by the hollow groan of shifting metal. The ship trembled slightly, sending dust raining from the ceiling. Miles grabbed the desk to steady himself. Beau barked once, sharp and afraid. Then, through the static of the broken radio console, a faint sound crackled to life, a voice distorted by interference. A woman's voice, repeating the same words again and again, soft, almost pleading, "If anyone hears this, we're still here. Please." Then silence. Miles stared at the radio, his pulse hammering. He checked the power. The system was completely disconnected. No cables, no signal source. The voice had come from nowhere, or everywhere. Bo whimpered and pressed her head against his leg. He crouched, stroked her fur, and whispered, "We're leaving." He gathered what he could, photographs, reports, one of the vials, and stuffed them into his pack. As he stepped back onto the deck, rain began to fall again, heavier this time, smearing the grime on the ship's windows. From the cliffs above, through the fog, a red light blinked once, and then again. Miles froze. It was no lighthouse. It was a drone, hovering silently, scanning. Someone was already looking for the ship. He turned toward the cliffs, pulling Bo close. "We've got to move." As they descended the broken gangway, the hum behind them deepened, resonating through the ship's hull like a heartbeat wakened from a long sleep. When they reached the ground, Miles looked back one last time. The word he'd seen the day before on the wall, faint and brown, was now clearer in the rain. It wasn't painted, it was written in blood. Alive. The morning fog rolled through the valley like smoke, and by the time Miles Harper reached the small coastal town of Linsmore, the sun was nothing more than a pale smear behind the clouds. His clothes were damp from the sea wind, his eyes bloodshot from a night without sleep. Every time he blinked, flashes of the ship's corridors haunted him. The bloodied message, the sealed doors, the whisper over the dead radio. He walked fast, Bo trotting beside him, through streets that smelled of wet asphalt and salt. The town was quiet, too quiet. Only the creak of old signs and the distant echo of gulls broke the silence. He knew exactly where he was going. At the far end of the harbor, behind a small cafe that never opened before noon, was the apartment of Elliot Corbett, a man Miles hadn't spoken to in years. Corbett had once been a journalist for the Atlantic Tribune, but after publishing a story about missing research vessels tied to Helios Foundation, he'd lost his job, his reputation, and, eventually, his sanity, at least according to the people who wanted him discredited. If anyone could help make sense of what Miles had found aboard the Aurora line, it was Corbett. He climbed the narrow staircase to the second floor and knocked. No answer. He waited, knocked again. 3 sharp raps. Still nothing. Bo sniffed the air and gave a low growl. Miles frowned. He tried the handle. The door creaked open. The smell hit him first. Iron and mold. The curtains were drawn, the air thick and still. Papers were scattered across the floor, photographs pinned to the walls with red string connecting them like veins. Every photo bore the same logo somewhere in the corner, Helios Foundation. In one, a smiling man in a lab coat stood beside a cruise ship, the Aurora line. "Corbett?" Miles called, voice low. No reply. He stepped farther inside. A chair lay overturned beside the desk. On it sat a half-empty mug of coffee, the surface hardened into a brown film. Then his eyes caught something on the wall near the window, a dark smear. He moved closer, flashlight shaken slightly in his hand. Blood. He turned slowly. Corbett was there, slumped beside the desk, his head resting awkwardly against the leg of a filing cabinet. His throat had been cut, the wound clean and deliberate. On the wall above him, written in that same dark fluid, were the words, "They're watching everything." Miles froze. For a moment, his mind refused to accept what his eyes saw. He crouched beside the body, checked for a pulse he already knew wasn't there. Corbett had been dead for hours, maybe since the night before. The blood on his shirt had dried, but the fear still lingered on his face, a frozen expression of disbelief. Bo whimpered behind him. Miles looked around the room again. Papers covered every surface. Maps, ship manifests, intercepted emails. Corbett had been digging for years, maybe since the day the Aurora line disappeared. He spotted an open laptop on the desk, its screen cracked but faintly glowing. He pressed a key. The desktop flickered to life, showing a single folder labeled Project Atlas. Inside were scanned documents, audio logs, and a video file titled Aurora_testimony.mp4. Miles clicked it. Static filled the screen for a moment before clearing to reveal Corbett himself. He looked nervous, his eyes darting towards the door as he spoke. "If you're seeing this, I'm probably gone. They came after the last man who tried to leak this. The Aurora wasn't lost, it was relocated. The passengers were part of something called Project Atlas, biological adaptability trials run offshore to avoid oversight. They used disease vectors, radiation, genetic treatments. When things went wrong, Helios ordered a full shutdown, but instead of rescue, The image cut to black. The video ended abruptly. Miles exhaled shakily. The truth was worse than he'd imagined. Helios hadn't just hidden the ship, they'd used it, and then erased every trace. He copied everything, documents, video, notes, onto his own flash drive. Then he noticed something else. A small envelope taped beneath the desk, sealed with wax and marked with a single word, evidence. He tore it open. Inside was a memory card and a handwritten note. "Miles, if you found this, it means you went back there. Don't trust anyone. They track communication. The files on this card are enough to expose them, but you'll need to make it public fast. Ek." The floorboards creaked above him. Miles's head snapped up. He glanced toward the ceiling, listening. Another sound followed, a soft thud, then the faint whine of metal. Someone was in the building. He grabbed the flash drive, the card, shoved them into his pocket, and drew his knife. Bo stood tense, growling low. The hallway outside was empty, but the air carried a smell he knew too well, oil and gunpowder. Then came the heavy, synchronized steps of boots on wood. He backed into the kitchen, eyes scanning for an exit. A window half open above the sink showed the fire escape outside. He climbed onto the counter, shoved the window wider, and pushed Bo through first. The door behind him burst open. A man in black tactical gear stepped in, face hidden behind a visor. On his chest, a small patch with a sun-shaped emblem, Helios. Miles dove through the window as a muffled shot exploded behind him. Glass shattered, slicing his arm. He hit the metal grating hard and rolled. Another shot rang out, sparking against the railing inches from his head. Bo barked, frantic. "Miles Harper," a voice shouted from inside, deep and calm. "You shouldn't have gone back to the ship." Miles didn't answer. He ran, feet pounding down the fire escape, every clang of metal a signal for pursuit. At the bottom, he leapt into the alley just as a van screeched around the corner. 2 more figures jumped out, all in black. No badges, no faces. Only the symbol. He sprinted toward the pier, rain slicking the pavement. One of the men raised a gun. A bullet whined past Miles's shoulder. He ducked behind a stack of crates, yanked his rifle from its strap, and fired once. The man fell. The others scattered. The town was awake now. Lights flickered in windows, voices shouted, but no one came out. They knew better. Helios owned fear here. Miles ran until the houses vanished behind him, until the sound of engines faded into the distance. When he finally stopped, gasping for breath, he stood on the cliffs again. The ocean spread dark and endless below. Bo pressed close to him, trembling. He took the flash drive from his pocket, gripping it so tight his knuckles went white. Somewhere inside that plastic shell was the truth, enough to destroy Helios, if he lived long enough to share it. He stared toward the distant silhouette of the Aurora line, still wedged between the rocks. The fog around it pulsed faintly, lit from within by flashes of lightning. "They kill Corbett," he whispered, "and they'll kill anyone else who knows." The storm began to rise again, the wind tearing at his jacket. Miles turned towards the path leading back to the shore. His decision was already made. He would go back to the ship. Not for answers, not for revenge, for proof. He looked down at Bo and murmured, "One last trip, girl, then we end this." Lightning flashed behind him, outlining the wreck against the sky like a ghost made of steel. And somewhere in the storm, far below, the sea answered with a low, echoing roar, as if the Aurora line itself had heard and approved. Night swallowed the cliffs in a slow, deliberate way, like the world itself was holding its breath. The only light came in pulses. Distant lightning strobed along the horizon, turning the ocean into a plate of rippling metal, and for the briefest moments the shattered hull of the Aurora line appeared and vanished again. There, not there, there again. Miles Harper moved fast along the ridge with Bo at his side. The wind clawed at his coat, shoving cold rain under the collar and into his bones. Every step along the mud-slick path felt like walking the spine of something ancient and angry. Below, waves slammed themselves against black rock, sending spray so high it felt like the sea was trying to climb back up the cliff after them. He had almost died once already today. He wasn't planning on dying quietly. Bo stayed close, ears back, moving low to the ground. She didn't make a sound. She understood in that wordless animal way that this wasn't just another hunt, not just a long night. Something final hung in the air. Miles reached the torn gangway, the same twisted metal tongue he had climbed before. Only now it leaned at a new angle, lower, straining, as if the ship itself had sunk deeper into the cliff. The steel moaned under each gust. He tested it with his weight, jaw tight. It held, barely. "Stay right behind me," he whispered. They climbed. The rain came in sudden sheets, making every foothold slick. Halfway up, the ocean wind rose, a hard, sideways blast that nearly tore him free. He dropped flat against the gangway and gripped the rails until his knuckles burned. Far below, the water churned black and white and hungry. He didn't look down again. Inside the torn opening of the hull, the air changed. The cold outside turned to a heavy, closed-in damp that tasted like metal, oil, and slow rot. The sound of the storm dulled. The sound of the ship grew louder. The Aurora line groaned around him with a deep, stressed voice, each vibration rattling somewhere in the walls. He flicked on his flashlight. The pale beam carved a path through damp air and dust. This time, he wasn't wandering. He knew exactly where he had to go. The heart, the engine decks, the control wiring, that's where Proof lived. That's where the men from Helios would go first. The corridors felt different than before. He noticed it immediately. Things had moved. A door that had been jammed shut was now open. A rolling cart that had been on its side was standing again. Footprints tracked through the thin skim of moisture on the floor, too large and too clean to belong to him. Fresh. Not hours. Minutes. He moved deeper, past the dining hall where plates and crystal goblets still waited for a dinner that never happened. Past the lounge where a child's toy car he'd taken had left a dustless outline on the floor. Past the wall where that single word had been smeared in dried brown. Alive. Every part of him felt watched. The ship felt watched. As he made his way down toward the lower decks, voices carried, Distant, muffled, professional. Not panic. Procedure. He killed the flashlight and listened. Engine bay first. We rigged that. We're done here. Copy that. Timer or remote? Remote. No countdown. No surprise. Pause. Then, and the witness? If he's still breathing, he's going with it. Miles exhaled once, slow. They knew he existed. Helios wasn't just here to retrieve whatever was left. They were here to erase the ship from history. Every wall, every body, every secret, him included. He felt the flash drive in his pocket. Corbett's last message. Corbett's blood. If he died here with it, the truth died too. He moved when the voices faded, down the last stairwell, into the deep. The engine deck was hot. The air hummed. The space was huge, ribbed with pipes and cables and towering machinery that rose into darkness. The floor vibrated with the slow pulse of the sea smashing itself against the cliff below. Somewhere, water leaked in a steady rhythm, plinking into black pools that reflected the flashlight and broken shards of pale light. Then he saw them. 3 men in matte black gear, faces hidden behind visors. No names. No insignias beyond that sun-shaped Helios emblem stamped on their vests. They moved like they'd done this before. No wasted motion. One carried a hard case that looked military. Another uncoiled thick yellow cable. The third knelt near one of the main supports and was fixing something metal and square to the steel. Explosives. They were going to sink the Aurora line. Not later. Now. He crouched in the shadows against a rusted housing panel, staying just outside the spill of their portable work lights. Bo pressed in at his knee, silent and rigid, muscles tight. He slowly, carefully, unzipped an outer pocket of his jacket. The camera was still intact, waterproof, compact, recording light steady and red, proof. He angled it low so it caught their hands, their gear, their voices. He didn't need their faces. The world didn't need guesses. The world needed to hear them arming charges on a supposedly lost ship. One of the men spoke quietly into a mic at his collar. Package is in place. Engine level. Moving to bridge next. Estimated collapse into the channel in under 2 hours. A voice answered through his earpiece, tinny and cold. Confirmed data sweep? Negative. Nothing salvageable. Ship's core systems are dead. That's fine, the voice replied. We're here to erase, not recover. Miles felt anger flare hot and fast in his chest. Not grief, not fear. Anger. Helios hadn't just killed Corbett. They were erasing 300 people like they'd never existed, turning a mass disappearance into a footnote and calling it weather. He shifted his weight. Just a fraction. Just enough to adjust his view. The sound he made was small, a scrape of boot on metal, but it was enough. All 3 helmets snapped toward the dark at once. Movement, one of them said sharply. 6 o'clock. Miles didn't wait. He grabbed Bo by the collar and moved, fast, low, silent no longer. He bolted along the narrow service walkway that wrapped behind the main generator housing. Shouts erupted behind him, hard and precise. Boots hit steel, then gunfire. The first shot cracked and sparked against the bulkhead inches from his shoulder, throwing flecks of hot metal into his face. The second shot punched through a pipe, releasing a hissing spray of steam so hot it flashed his skin red. Bo yelped but kept pace, darting ahead, leading him through the maze of pipes and shadowed machinery. This way, he hissed. He cut left through a maintenance corridor, up a ladder slick with condensation, and through a half-collapsed doorway. He could hear them following. 3 sets of boots, closing. Efficient. Hunting. Not reckless. He slammed his shoulder against the next door and stumbled into a storage bay. Shelves of medical crates had been torn open and looted. He recognized the red hazard symbols. He recognized the Helios Foundation seal stamped on the broken lids. This wasn't a cruise ship. It had never been a cruise ship. It had been a floating lab. And whatever they'd been doing down here, the people on board had figured it out too late to escape. There were gouges on the walls. Not tool marks, fingers. Human hands clawing against steel. The kind of marks that don't come from fear. They come from desperation. Bo whined low. "We keep moving," Miles whispered. He pushed through another door, then stopped dead. The hallway ahead led upward toward the central stairwell, and beyond that, the bridge. The air here was colder, carrying a draft from outside. He could almost feel open sky at the end of it. Freedom. But, strung along the walls leading up toward the bridge, was something new. Something that made his stomach go cold. Cable. Yellow detonator line. Fresh. They weren't just planning to break the ship loose from the cliff. They were going to drop everything into the water. Bridge, decks, engines, evidence, bodies, all of it in one clean collapse. They were cutting Aurora Line out of the world. He moved fast, tracing the cables with his hand until he found the junction box screwed into a support beam at hip level. It was armored, with a digital readout glowing dimly behind a cracked plastic cover. The numbers were steady. No countdown. He understood instantly. Remote triggered. They could blow it whenever they wanted. He knelt, hands steady, breath slow. He'd never been demolition tech, but he'd been a power man on cargo ships. Panels had logic. Circuits had order. Cut the wrong line, something fired early. Cut the right line, the system went quiet. Behind him, footsteps. Closer. He forced himself to focus. 3 main leads braided together. Power, signal, relay. Whoever built it knew what they were doing. He pulled a folding blade from his pocket, slit the tip carefully under the middle lead, and listened to the hum inside the box. He closed his eyes. Listened harder. That's the relay. He cut. For a single heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the light on the box flickered, struggled, and died. The hum stopped. The cable went inert in his hand. He exhaled once. Quiet relief. Then the deck shifted under his feet. Not an explosion. Something worse. A grinding, tearing, groaning roar rolled through the ship from below, so deep it felt like the bones of the world were moving. The Aurora Line lurched forward, just a fraction, but enough to send a jagged scream of metal on stone echoing through the structure. Somewhere, far beneath them, the cliff was giving way. They had waited too long. The ship was losing its grip on the land. Bo stumbled and slid. Miles grabbed her scruff, yanked her back before she could go over the edge of a twisted stair. Plates rained from the ceiling. A light fixture tore loose and swung like a pendulum, crashing against the wall and bursting into shards. Then the shouting came. Close now, just around the corner. Target's in the stairwell. Take him alive if you can. If not, doesn't matter. Miles ran. Up the stairs, past peeling wallpaper and shattered glass, past cabins that still held suitcases, clothes folded for a vacation that never ended, past a child's drawing taped to a wall with the words, "Mom, look, we saw whales," in bright crayon. He burst onto the bridge. The air up here was colder, touched by rain and salt. The windows were shattered, open to the storm. Wind howled through the broken frames, scattering paper and grit across the floor. Lightning flashed, and the sea appeared below, far, far below. The bow still hung over open air like a blade. The ocean raged beneath it. The height made him sway. He turned, fast, barricade, cover, weapon, exit. Options snapped through his mind in a rush, and then they were there. 2 of the Helios men stormed through the doorway, weapons raised. Miles dove behind the dead navigation console as gunfire tore into the captain's chair and split it clean in half. Splinters of fabric and foam burst into the air like snow. Bo lunged, teeth bared, straight for the nearest man's arm. He kicked at her hard. She staggered but didn't back off. Miles grabbed a metal rod from the storm-littered floor, maybe part of a railing, maybe part of the equipment rack, and hurled it with everything he had. It struck the second man in the shoulder and knocked him sideways into the cracked glass of a display panel. The man slammed down, helmet bouncing against the deck with a sharp metallic clack. The first man swung his weapon toward Miles. Miles didn't duck. He charged. The hit wasn't clean. He wasn't 20 anymore, and he wasn't armored. But he slammed the man back against the bulkhead, forced the barrel off target, and drove his forearm hard into the visor. The man staggered. The rifle clattered to the deck. Bo was on him in an instant, jaws locked just below the wrist, shaking. The second man was already recovering. Miles grabbed the fallen rifle and fired a single shot. The impact threw the man backward, dropping him hard. He didn't get up. Silence. Almost. Only rain. Only wind. Only the low groan of the ship dying under them. Bo limped to Miles's side, panting, favoring one leg but still on her feet. He dropped to one knee and ran his hand over her fur. "Good girl," he whispered, his voice raw. "Good girl." Then a different sound cut through the air, a distant mechanical thrum, low, growing, rhythmic. He looked up. Beyond the shattered bridge windows, through the ragged spray of the storm, a dark shape moved in the sky. A helicopter, unmarked, hovering just beyond the cliff line. Rain hammered against its hull and whipped in crazy spirals from the downwash. Light from inside flickered across the broken glass of the bridge. They were extracting. They weren't running. They were finishing it. On instinct, Miles spun to the emergency cabinet bolted to the wall. Glass already gone. Contents still there. He grabbed the flare gun, cracked it open, jammed around inside, and stepped into the open frame of the bridge where the windows had once been. Wind tore at him, rain stung his face like grit. The drop below him went down forever. He aimed at the sky and fired. The flare screamed upward, a streak of angry red that split the darkness and burst high above the ship like a wound. For a moment, the entire cliff face lit up in bloody light. The torn hull of the Aurora Line glowed. The waves below flashed. The helicopter lurched sideways in the blast of sudden glare. Out there, somewhere off the coast, any boat still awake would see that. Someone would know something was wrong. Someone would come. He prayed that would matter. He turned back, just as a figure stepped into the bridge doorway. This one didn't rush. He didn't shout. He didn't raise his weapon immediately. He just stood there, steady in the flickering light, visor black, rain dripping from the edges of his gear. The patch on his chest wasn't just the Helios sun. This one had rank bars sewn under it. "Miles Harper," the man said through the mask, voice steady, almost calm. "You should have stayed quiet." Miles lifted the rifle. "You should have sunk the ship 3 years ago." The man tilted his head just slightly. "We tried." He held up a small device. A trigger, a remote, smooth, compact, military work. Miles felt his heartbeat slam once, hard. He'd disabled the junction box, but he hadn't found every line. "We're done here," the man said simply. "And so are you." He pressed the trigger. The world didn't explode all at once. It tore. The blast started deep in the lower decks with a sound like a giant metal heart being ripped open. The floor under Miles's boots bucked hard enough to throw him to his knees. The bridge split along a jagged seam. Control panels ripped loose and flew. Windows shattered inward in a spray of glass and rain and screaming wind. The ship lurched forward. Hard. For a split second, Miles felt weightless. No floor, no up, no down. Just cold air and the dizzying, impossible feeling of falling while still standing. Then gravity snapped back and threw him sideways into the railing. His shoulder exploded with pain. Bo slid across the deck, claws scraping for purchase, and he grabbed her by the collar before she went skidding through the shattered opening and out into the open air. Steel screamed around them. Stone answered. Water roared. The Aurora line finally broke. The bow sheared free from the cliff with a grinding shriek that vibrated through his bones. The world tilted, then dropped as the entire front half of the ship tipped forward into empty space. The helicopter banked away, vanishing into storm and darkness. The Helios man stumbled, grabbed for a support beam, and disappeared as the deck beneath him simply wasn't there anymore. Miles held on. To Bo, to the railing, to life. Wind tore past them like the breath of a god. Rain became knives. The sky spun, the sea rushed up all at once, a churning mouth of black water and shattered light. Then the world hit him. Hard, cold, total, and everything went white. At first, there was no sound, only pressure. Hard, crushing, absolute. Miles didn't know which way was up. Water slammed into him from every direction at once, tearing at his clothes, forcing its way into his mouth, his nose, his lungs. Salt burned his throat. His head rang with a deep, metallic roar, like the ocean was full of screaming steel. He tried to move and felt himself spinning through a storm of debris. A jagged edge of metal scraped across his back. Something heavy struck his shoulder and numbness spread down his arm. He kicked hard, blind, his chest burned. The world stayed black. Then, through that suffocating dark, he felt movement against him. A struggling weight. Claws. Bo. He grabbed for her on instinct. His fingers brushed wet fur, then slipped. Panic cut through the fog, and he kicked harder, pulling, dragging, fighting upward. His lungs felt like they were going to tear open. And then, all at once, he broke the surface. Air. Cold, violent air. He choked and coughed seawater, gasping in ragged bursts as waves hammered him, shoving him down, letting him rise just long enough to breathe once before slamming him again. The ocean all around him was chaos. Churning water foamed with oil, splinters, and twisted metal. Huge sections of the Aurora line were still crashing down, hitting the surface with sickening force and vanishing into the black depth below. Lightning cracked somewhere far above, and for a split second, the world lit up white-blue. In that flash, he saw what was left of the ship, broken open like an animal carcass, ribs of steel jutting into the sky, fire flickering at the torn edges where the charges had gone off. The cliff side where the hull had once been wedged was now just a jagged wound in the rock. Another wave rolled over him. Salt filled his nose, burned his eyes. He fought to stay above water, one arm locked around Bo, kicking hard to keep them both afloat. She coughed and flailed, but she was breathing, alive. That single fact kept his mind clear enough not to let go. He forced himself to look for land. The shore couldn't be far. He had been thrown close in by the impact. The current dragged them sideways, slamming them toward a spray-wrapped reef. He turned his body and used the pull, angling them toward the rocks instead of fighting the rip. His shoulders screamed with every kick. He kept going. When his hand finally hit stone, it felt unreal. Slick. Solid. Real. He clawed for it and hauled himself up onto a slab of black rock, just as another wave crashed over his legs and tried to take him back under. He held on, teeth clenched, until the surge pulled away again. Then, he shoved Bo higher onto the rocks, pushed himself after her, and collapsed on his back, chest heaving, every muscle shaken. For a long time, Miles didn't move. He just lay there, gulping air, listening. The storm was dying. The wind hadn't stopped, but it had fallen from rage to exhaustion. Rain came in sheets, and then in drifts, and then in mist. The surf still pounded itself against the cliffs, but the sounds were changing. Slower, lower, the kind of sound the sea makes after it's taken what it came for. Bo dragged herself closer and pressed against his side, trembling. He rolled onto one elbow with a wince and ran his hand down her neck. Her breathing was fast but steady. She lifted her head and looked at him, eyes wide and bright and alive. "Good girl," he whispered, voice raw and cracked. "You hear me? Good girl." He sat up, every part of him hurt. His shoulder throbbed, his ribs burned, his skin stung wherever the metal had torn him. He was soaked through and shaken from cold. But he was awake. He was breathing. He was still here. That alone felt like defiance. Slowly, he lifted his head and took in what the sea had left behind. The Aurora line was gone, not sunk in one piece, not swallowed whole, not drifting out to sea. Gone, shattered, ripped apart and thrown across the shallows like bones. Great ribs of hull jutted out of the surf at sick angles. Sections of deck lay crumpled on their sides, half submerged, waves breaking over them and surging back in long, hissing breaths. White foam boiled between twisted beams. Here and there, pieces of interior had been torn clean out and tossed onto the rocks. A lifeboat mount, half a staircase, a row of bolted dining chairs still connected like teeth in a jaw. The ocean wasn't hiding the wreck. It was showing it. He pushed himself unsteadily to his feet. His legs felt hollow and untrustworthy, but they held. He slid down from the rock slab to the narrow strip of wet, black sand below, then staggered forward through the shallows, boots crunching over glass, ceramic, splintered wood. Bodies. The word flickered through his mind, and he forced himself to look. But he didn't see them. Not yet. Maybe they were deeper, still trapped in what was left of the lower decks, below where his eyes could reach. Maybe the tide hadn't given them back. Not yet. Maybe the sea wasn't done deciding what to keep. A low mist swept across the shore, clinging to everything. It made the wreckage look almost unreal, like the scattered bones of something ancient. Then he saw it. Near a jagged spill of metal plating, half buried in kelp and torn insulation, lay a small black case. Intact. Sealed. Marked with a red latch. The sight of it sent a shock through him sharper than any pain in his body. He splashed toward it, dropped to his knees, and tore it free from the tangle. The lock was stiff, but it opened. Inside, cushioned in foam, was a hardened data drive, industrial marine grade, waterproof, shock-resistant, stenciled across the casing in clean block print, Helios Project Archive. A 7. For a moment, he could only stare. His heart hammered so hard it hurt. Then he laughed. A raw, broken sound that wasn't joy, not really, but something close to relief and fury tied together. The same feeling as a man who's been buried alive and suddenly finds air. They had tried to burn the evidence. They had tried to blow it into the sea and let the tide take it under and grind it down. But the sea had thrown proof right back onto his shore. The ocean hadn't just spared him. It had answered him. He lifted the drive with shaking hands and slid it into his pack. His fingers brushed something else there. His camera. He snatched it out, half afraid it would be cracked open, dead, lost. It wasn't. The screen was fractured, spider-webbed with thin lines of damage, but when he pressed the power, the little red light flickered and held. It was still recording. It had seen the men in Helios gear. It had heard their voices. It had captured the charges, the plan, the orders to erase. It had watched them admit what the world had never been allowed to know. The Aurora line wasn't a tragedy. It was a cleanup. He swallowed hard. His throat felt like torn rope. "Okay," he whispered. "Okay. Okay." He turned, looking out past the curling rush of the surf, past the jagged floating debris and the fractured silhouette of what had once been a luxury ship. The horizon was just a hard gray line, but on that line, faint and small and steady, he saw lights. A boat. Fishing vessel, by the look of it. Low, slow, moving in, not out. He felt the last of the cold shock inside him harden into purpose. If that boat reached him first, the truth lived. If Helios reached him first, it died. He didn't get a second chance. Corbett hadn't. The people on the ship hadn't. He couldn't let the story end in gray water and silence. He pulled himself higher onto the rocks where the incoming tide wouldn't reach, built a small fire from driftwood and broken chair legs and wall paneling, anything that would catch. The wood was wet, but the wind helped. After a few stubborn minutes, it took, then flared. Smoke curled upward in a thin black ribbon. Firelight washed over the wreckage in a dirty orange glow. Bo curled against his leg, head resting on his boot, finally still. Miles sat with the camera in his hands. He angled it toward himself. His hands were shaken. His face was streaked with salt, blood, soot, and rain. He looked like something dragged out of a grave. Good, he thought dimly. Let them see. Let them see. He pressed record. "My name is Miles Harper," he said, voice low but steady. "If you're hearing this, it means I'm still alive, or at least the camera is." He took a breath. The words came easier once they started. "This coastline is about 30 miles north of Linsmore. You can match the rock formations. You're going to find debris here in the water. Plating, personal effects, cabin sections. A lot of it's going to look like it came from a cruise ship. That's because it did. The ship's name was the Aurora Line. You've heard of it." He looked out at the black water, then back into the lens. "They told you it was lost in a storm 3 years ago. They told you there were no survivors, no bodies, no wreck. That wasn't true. The ship wasn't lost at sea. It was moved here, hidden on the cliffs. I've been inside it. I've seen what was done there." His jaw tightened. He forced himself to keep his voice level. This wasn't a cruise ship at the end. It was a Helios Foundation facility. They turned it into a lab. I saw the reports. I saw the treatment logs. They were experimenting on passengers, people who paid for a vacation, families with kids. They called them subjects. They locked entire groups below the lower decks. When things went wrong, they didn't call for help. They cut the ship's comms and redirected course under blackout orders. He looked down, swallowed, continued. "I found a wall down there, and someone wrote 'alive.'" For a moment, his voice almost cracked. He pushed through it. "That means people were still alive after the Aurora Line disappeared. After the world stopped looking. They were trapped there, begging to be let out, and nobody came for them because Helios didn't want rescue. Helios wanted silence. Behind him, the ocean hissed and breathed, swallowing and returning foam. "Tonight," he said, "they came back to finish it. Helios sent a team, 3 men in tactical gear, no IDs. They planted explosives in the engine deck and along the main supports. I heard them. I filmed them. You'll hear it in this footage." They weren't here for survivors. They were here to erase everything, to knock the ship off the cliff and sink it fast, so the wreck would scatter and look like old storm damage if someone ever found anything. He lifted the camera slightly, as if he were offering it to whoever might receive it. I've got them on video, placing charges. I've got their voices giving orders. I've got them admitting they're here to erase, not recover. I pulled a drive from the wreck before it went under. It's labeled Helios Project Archive A7. It survived the fall. It's in my pack. If I don't make it, whoever finds this, get that drive to someone who can make noise. Press, courts, internet, anyone. Don't sit on it. Don't negotiate with them. Don't sell it. Get it out. He took one more breath. The fire crackled softly beside him. Heat licked at his hands. His body felt like stone and bruise and exhaustion, but his mind was fixed and bright and sharp. They're going to say I'm lying, he said. They're going to say I'm crazy or violent or responsible. They're going to say this was an accident. It wasn't. You'll see the proof. You'll see the charges. You'll hear them. You'll see the ship fall. Wind gusted in, scattering embers, making the fire gutter and flare. He didn't look away from the camera. Listen to me, he said quietly. This was never a storm story. It was a cover story. They didn't lose these people. They buried them. He let the silence hang for one heartbeat. 2. The only sounds were the slow roll of waves and Beau's tired breathing. Then he finished. The sea remembers, he said. You can sink a ship. You can kill a story. You can shoot a man in his own home like you shot Corbett. But you don't get to erase 300 people and walk away clean. The ocean brought this back. I'm bringing it the rest of the way. He ended the recording. For a moment, he just sat there, feeling the weight of what he'd said settle in his bones. The fear was still there, but it had changed shape. It wasn't cold anymore. It burned. Out past the rocks, the boat was closer now. He could hear its engine over the water, low and steady, cutting through the current instead of fighting it. 2 figures stood near the bow, flashlights sweeping the shoreline. He saw them pause, saw one of the beams lock onto the flicker of his fire. Miles pushed himself to his feet. Pain shot through his shoulder, but he didn't fall. Beau stood with him, limping slightly but keeping pace. When the vessel finally nosed in between 2 jagged outcrops, the men aboard stared in stunned silence. Their lights traced the twisted metal, the shattered decks, the debris field stretching across the surf. One of them climbed down into the shallows and splashed toward him, eyes wide. "What happened out here?" the man demanded, voice shaken. Miles didn't bother answering that. There wasn't time for the long version. There wasn't time for disbelief. He held out the camera in one hand and the hard case in the other. "You need to see this," he said, voice low, steady, absolute. "And the world needs to hear it." The man looked from Miles's face to the camera, to the wreckage, to the dog pressed against his leg. Whatever he saw there, blood, ruin, certainty, was enough. He nodded once. "Get on," he said. "Now." They pulled Beau aboard first, then hauled Miles up after her. The boat turned slowly, engine humming, pushing off the rocks and angling back toward open water. Away from the cliffs, away from what was left of the Aurora line. Miles sat on the deck, back against a coil of rope, cradling the hard drive against his chest like something alive. Spray hit his face. Wind cut at his skin. Every part of him ached. His vision pulsed at the edges. But he did not let go. He watched the coastline fall away behind them. Watched the broken skeleton of the ship vanish piece by piece into mist. Watched the sea begin to reclaim what was left, pulling twisted steel and shattered glass and torn fabric slowly, patiently down into the dark. Then, in the distance, the last jagged ribs of the Aurora line slipped beneath the black surface and were gone. No grave marker, no memorial, no names. Just water, calm again, like nothing had ever happened. But something had happened. And this time, it wasn't staying secret. Miles let out a long breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The exhaustion finally hit him like a weight. He closed his eyes, head resting back against cold metal. Bo curled up against him, finally still. He whispered, just loud enough for himself to hear, "They can sink ships, they can bury names, but they can't bury what the ocean remembers." The boat pushed forward into the gray, carrying him, the dog, and the truth. The Aurora line was destroyed, but the truth survived. Miles proved that even when power tries to bury justice, the sea always brings it back. Subscribe for more stories like this, hit the like button, and tell us in the comments what you think of this ending.